Good afternoon, everybody. This is Madi from the Centre for Extramural Studies. So I'm now going to hand over to Professor Graham Fegan, who is going to be doing the introductions for the speakers for the week. Thank you very much, and thank you for joining us.
Right, hi, thank you, Madi, and good evening to everybody. Welcome to this winter school course. I must say, sitting here in the glorious late afternoon sun at Gosia, it's hard to believe it's winter. It certainly doesn't look like winter. But looking at the green slopes of Devil's Peak, I guess it is winter. So my name is Graham Fegan. As Madi said, I'm a neurosurgeon here at Gosia and at UCT, and I also have the job of running the Neuroscience Institute. And Madi approached us with a request to put together an interesting program related to neuroscience. And I'm really excited to introduce this program we've organized with Dr. Dale Rae from the Department of Human Biology and a really world-respected authority on sleep. And it really seemed that sleep would be a wonderful topic to look at as a real interdisciplinary area of research and an area that really is of interest to every living person. So just very briefly tell you about the Neuroscience Institute. So the Neuroscience Institute was accredited by UCT 5 years ago as an interdisciplinary research institute. Our base is here at Gosia, but we're really interested in brain function well beyond the confines of just what's clinically important. And one of the most important things we focused on is public engagement in order to really increase people's awareness and interest in the human brain. So sleep clearly has tremendous relevance to neuroscience, and the speakers that we're going to introduce today, that you're going to have the pleasure of listening to over the next 5 days, are all able to bring a unique and fascinating lens to bear on the topic of sleep. So the first speaker is going to be Dr. Dale Rae, who is my co-host. So Dale is Director of Sleep Science in the Division of Physiological Sciences in the Department of Human Biology at UCT. Dale graduated from UCT with a PhD in exercise physiology 14 years ago, and has ever since then worked as a researcher at UCT. She's really become a national authority at sleep and is currently Director of Sleep Science at UCT. And I'm really looking forward to Dale kicking off the series with a talk on the physiology of sleep. Clearly, brain function is a critical aspect of sleep, particularly disordered sleep. And tomorrow we're going to listen to a very engaging talk by Dr. Gosia Lipinska from the Division of Neuropsychology in the Department of Psychology at UCT. So Gosia has a strong background in sleep science and clinical work in a whole range of different neurological disorders. And her research interests lie in understanding the cognitive and emotional sequelae of healthy and interrupted sleep. And she's going to talk to us about the neuropsychology, both normal and abnormal, of sleep. So sleep is clearly not something that only humans do, as anyone who owns pets knows. And I'm really looking forward to Dr. Adhil Bhagwandin, one of my colleagues here in Health Sciences faculty, who we recently recruited from WITS. Adhil did a PhD at WITS in neuroscience, and then a couple of interesting postdocs around the world before going back to WITS to set up his research program, which really looks at comparative neuroanatomy across different species. And we were very lucky to recruit him to UCT a few years ago, and he's going to talk to us about insights that we can gain from understanding sleep in animals, maybe what that teaches us about humans. And I'm hoping he'll talk about one of his more recent interests, which is something called the lymphatic system, which functions in the brain, particularly during sleep. So just to prove that neuroscience covers all bases, we've invited one of my colleagues here from Gosia, Dr. Symons, who is a very well-known and widely respected pulmonologist who has a particular interest in the condition of obstructive sleep apnea and a lot of the adverse medical consequences of people not sleeping well. And Greg will be talking about that on Thursday. And then we'll end off with a speaker that pretty much anybody who has participated in summer school or winter school before will probably have come across, and that's Professor Mark Solms, who is the head of neuropsychology at UCT. So Mark did his PhD actually in the neurosurgery service, also in Joburg at Bhagwandin Hospital, and did a PhD looking at the effects of brain lesions on dreaming. And that's got Mark interested not only in dreaming, but also in emotion. He subsequently went to UK and trained as a psychoanalyst, and has really established the new interdisciplinary field of neuropsychoanalysis. And he recently published a book, which I really encourage you to get your hands on, called The Hidden Spring, A Journey to the Source of Consciousness. So Mark will give the last talk of this series, where he'll wrap up a lot of the neuropsychological and other interesting neuroscience aspects of sleep. But just to kick off with the physiology of what normal sleep is, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Dale Rae to give today's lecture. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Graham, for the introduction, and hello, everybody. I'm so excited to be able to chat to you. This is something that I'm super passionate about, and I'm really excited to share this with you. I'm going to turn my camera off just so that the internet connection is a little bit better. Please keep your questions for the end. You can either just jot them down and we'll have question time at the end, or if you wish to pop them into the chat, you can also do that as we go along so that you don't forget what you'd like to ask. Okay, so you should all be able to see my screen, and let's get straight into it with the physiology of sleep. So this here is Steve Harvey. So I don't know, can you see that? There we go. So he's a talk show host in the US, and relatively recently in 2019, he made the rather infamous comment that rich people don't sleep 8 hours a day. That's a third of your life. You cannot be asleep for 8 hours every day. And he basically intimated that if you want to be successful, you can't be the person who's doing that much sleep. This obviously kicked off a whole lot of debate and controversy around sleep and sleep duration, because it turns out people are pretty polarized when it comes to sleep. So history is absolutely littered with a number of really, really impressive people who apparently slept very little. Leonardo da Vinci apparently did 20-minute cat naps every 4 hours in a 24-hour period, and Nikola Tesla, the inventor, was reported to only sleep 1.5 to 2 hours. Indeed, there are more modern day individuals who are at the top of their game who also seem to survive on 4 to 6 hours of sleep. And let me tell you, I would be the first in line, and I would pay a lot of money to be that person who can survive all 4 hours of sleep. It would certainly free up your day, give you loads more time to get stuff done. It seems really impressive, but I wonder about how sustainable this really is, and whether or not these individuals are not the exception rather than the rule. Indeed, when we look at athletes, they seem to be quite different in their approach. Usain Bolt reports sleeping 8 to 10 hours of sleep per night, and he says that's because that's when his body does his rest and recovery. And Roger Federer says that if he doesn't sleep 11 to 12 hours per night, it's just not right. So it's fascinating to me that there's such differences in people's approaches to sleep. And everybody has a sleep story. It's something that we all do and we all can relate to. But there seem to be so many cultural, behavioral, genetics, and maybe even just knowledge and information-based differences between people and our approaches to sleep. So it's such a fascinating topic. Let's have a look at some of the biology behind it, though. So we're going to look at, from a physiological perspective, what sleep is exactly, how it's regulated, a little bit of information on why we sleep, because it's not entirely clear, to be honest, and then also a quick dip into what healthy sleep looks like. So sleep's a behavioral state, and it's a state in which we experience perceptual disengagement from or unresponsiveness to the environment. So I think of it like this: we essentially are able to let our guard down when we sleep, so that we can put ourselves into a virtual cocoon where we don't necessarily hear, feel, smell, touch, taste things that are happening around us. So we're giving ourselves a sensory break, so we don't need to process what's going on. And that is very much so that our body, both physically and emotionally and mentally, can recover. Fortunately, it's an easily reversible state. It doesn't take much effort to get us into a state of wakefulness. It's super complicated from a regulation perspective. We're going to go into that in a bit of quick detail later, but there are multiple systems within the brain which are responsible for regulating sleep. And it's usually accompanied by postural recumbence, behavioral quiescence, and closed eyes. And of course, there's appropriate and inappropriate places to be asleep. To understand the structure of sleep, scientists use a technique called polysomnography, or PSG, and that's essentially what this gentleman here is hooked up to. If any of you have ever had the opportunity to have an overnight sleep study done, this may be what you experienced. You can see that there are many things that are going on here. So this guy has a number of electrodes on his brain, on his head here, so that we can look at the activity, the electrical activity in his brain. He also has little tiny electrodes next to his eyes so that we can look at his eye movements. And he has an electrode on his chin here so we can look at muscle activity. These bands here look at respiration. And we also have this pulse oximeter here so that we can look at ECG, so heart rate related variables, and oxygen saturation. So it's quite a get up, but it allows us to get a lot of information, both from a research and from a clinical perspective. But if we zoom in on just the information that we get from the electrodes which are on his head to look at the brain activity, that helps us understand the structure of sleep by being able to determine what stages of sleep this person might be in. So essentially, with sleep, we're either awake or asleep, and then sleep itself is divided into two distinct stages: non-REM sleep and REM sleep, where REM stands for rapid eye movement sleep, and I'm sure you've heard of that before. So if we were to look at the electrical activity, or the EEG trace, from a person who is awake, the electrical activity would look something like this. So this is what we call high frequency, low amplitude EEG activity, and that's a busy brain, a brain that's busy processing and thinking, and of course level of consciousness is quite high. Then the person will typically move into what's called stage 1 sleep. This is a super light phase of sleep. You can see that there's a little bit of an increase in the amplitude, but more the period here is increased slightly in terms of the activity in the brain, so it's a gentle slowing down, and consciousness is still pretty high. And then in stage 2, this is now a little bit of a change in terms of the EEG activity. This is an intermediate phase of sleep where the amplitude is beginning to increase, and there's specific hallmark features to this part of sleep which helps us identify the stage of sleep. And then stage 3, it's no longer 3 and 4, it's actually just 3, is what we call slow wave sleep, or you might think of it as deep sleep. And we can see here that the electrical activity in the brain is very different. They have very large amplitudes and a very low frequency in terms of the electrical activity in the brain, and generally consciousness is very low. And then REM sleep looks much more like stage 1, or even wake, where the brain is relatively busy again. Not that it's not busy in stages 1 and 2, but it's busy in a different way. But the primary difference here is that we are temporarily paralyzed from a musculoskeletal perspective, so that we can't move in this stage of sleep. So once we measure this throughout the night, we can put it together and we generate a little picture like this, which is called a hypnogram. This is obviously very stylized. Nobody produces such a neat hypnogram, but it really just helps us understand what happens as we sleep. So this is the person's sort of 7.5 to 8 hour sleep opportunity over here. So they start off awake, so a relatively busy brain, then they'll slowly drop down into stage N1. That's that very light phase of sleep. And at this point, if I were to tap you on your shoulder and say, hey, wake up, you would go, no, I wasn't asleep, promise, just lying here. So you often very much feel like you're not asleep. The sleep is that light, but technically you are actually in this first stage of sleep. Then we typically go down to stage 2, N2. And now if I tap you on your shoulder and say, hey, wake up, your brain will register that you've been disturbed, but you will not usually wake up yourself. And then you go down to N3, which is that lovely deep sleep or slow wave sleep. And following that, you generally will pop up and have a little quick burst of REM, or rapid eye movement sleep. And then if all goes well, you pop down again to stage 2, 3, and back up to REM. And the cycling here between REM and non-REM sleep are known as sleep cycles. And each one takes about 90 to 100 minutes, and we usually have 4 or 5 of them in any given night. What you'll notice here is that there's an awakening in the middle part of the sleep here. So for most of us, our sleep is generally divided into 2 quite distinct halves, the first and the second half, often punctuated by an arousal or an awakening. Most of us, if we wake up at this sort of midpoint of our sleep, so it's often between 1 and 3 a.m., we generally quickly scan our environment, turn over, and go back to sleep, and all is well. For people who struggle with sleep, very often this can become that bewitching hour where getting back to sleep can be really difficult. You'll also notice that the structure of the sleep changes throughout the night. In the first third, there's a lot more of this N3 or deep sleep here, that takes place. And as the night progresses, the bouts of REM increase such that we have much more REM in the latter part of our sleep. From what we understand, our slow wave sleep is important for physical repair and recovery. For example, we produce a lot of the hormone growth hormone at this stage of sleep. And so we think this is particularly important for, obviously, for athletes, for anybody growing, and just for general maintenance and repair as well, probably for the immune system too. And REM sleep seems to be more associated with mental and emotional processing and recovery. It's obviously not quite as distinct as that. It's not quite as cut and dry, but it certainly seems to be that the majority of our physical repair and recovery happens in slow wave sleep, and the majority of the mental and emotional processing and recovery seems to happen in REM sleep. And in fact, REM sleep is such an important component of our sleep that there's some studies which have shown in which creatures were deprived of REM sleep for the course of the study ultimately died. So we know that also as humans, when we have been deprived of REM sleep, which often happens with certain medication, then following that, when the body is able to, again, it'll then prioritize REM sleep and in order to try to recover some of the lost REM sleep in the weeks or days gone by. So typically, we should spend about half of our nights in stage 2, that's N2. We should spend about 1/5 of our night in slow wave or deep sleep, and we should spend about 1/4 of our night in REM sleep. For people who struggle with sleep, they often will have either reduced REM or reduced N3, and that can leave you feeling pretty grotty and unrecovered or unrested the next day. And usually what we see is then an increase in N1 to something like 10 or 15%. And that's not a great space to be sleeping in. People who have a lot of N1 will often report that they feel that they didn't sleep at all, that they just lay there awake all night long. And so their sleep is very non-restorative. In terms of understanding how sleep is regulated, the current thinking is quite simplistically, is that it's regulated through the interaction of 2 oscillatory processes, the sleep homeostat and the circadian system. And they have different functions, which I'm going to explain now. The sleep homeostat seems to be important in the generation of sleep. So we say that it's sleep generating, whereas the circadian system has a role to play in terms of promoting wakefulness. So let's have a look at each of those in a little bit more detail. So the sleep homeostat is affectionately known as the hourglass oscillator, and it tracks your history of sleep and wakefulness and thereby tracks sleep debt. So the way that I think about it is that when you wake from a good sleep or a good number of sleeps and you are sleep replete, as we say, you don't have too much sleep debt, your little hourglass is full. And as the day goes by, the longer you're awake, the sand trickles out of the hourglass. And as that happens, we build up something called sleep pressure. And so sleep pressure is that sensation that you might get that you absolutely feel exhausted and you need to get your head onto a pillow and get to sleep. So we have very little sleep pressure once we wake up, if we are sleep replete. And as the day goes by, we build up more and more sleep pressure. And it's actually really important because without sleep pressure, we don't get that strong desire to go to sleep at the end of the day. So it can make it really difficult to program yourself or be disciplined enough to get ready for bed. And then fortunately, once we hop into bed and we have good sleep, then our hourglass is flipped around and that sleep pressure dissipates. So this sleep homeostat is really important for maintaining duration and intensity of sleep. So what I mean by that is that when a person has a lot of sleep debt, then the sleep pressure builds up more quickly and asks the person to sleep for longer. And often you have a lot of good, strong, deep sleep to pay back your sleep debt. Whereas a person who is sleep replete might be asked to sleep a little bit less, depending on what their history is like. The other controller or regulator of sleep is our circadian system. So we need to speak very briefly about circadian rhythms. I'll just introduce you to them super quick so that you can understand this. So the word circadian comes from the 2 Latin words circa and dien, which means about a day. So these are rhythms in your body that have a period or that oscillate over approximately 24 hours. In fact, it is controlled by what we call your master clock. And so your master clock is located in the suprachiasmatic nuclei in the hypothalamus in the SCN. And the master clock is essentially a network of interacting clock genes. And without going into the detail, essentially it's a molecular clock which runs on an approximately 24-hour period. It's actually just tiny bit longer than 24 hours. And the master clock is like the conductor of the orchestra, if you want to look at it like that, because actually every single cell in your body has a little clock in it. So every single cell can tell the time. But of course, each of those cells, and therefore all of our organs and all of our systems, need to be integrated so that they all function on the same time. And that is the role of the master clock. So your circadian rhythms generate our 24-hour sleep-wake rhythms. So they ask us essentially to be awake at a certain time of day and asleep at a certain time of day, and they are synchronized to the light-dark cycle. And that's a really important component of our physiology. So the circadian system provides alerting signals which counteract sleep pressure during wakefulness. And essentially, the circadian system determines the preferred timing of sleep and wakefulness. So I'm sure that you've heard of the terms owls and larks when it comes to sleep. So night owls are those people who don't like to be up early in the morning, would generally sleep in till 8, 9, 10 if they could. If they're extreme night owls, even a bit later, and they have a very late bedtime. So they're super happy to go to bed at midnight, 1, 2, even 3 in the morning. And that is almost entirely driven by their circadian system, where they have a slightly longer clock than the rest of us. And so they have a very much delayed sleep-wake timing. It's quite normal though, even though it's delayed. Larks, on the other hand, are those early birds. Those are the ones that are up at 4, 5, 6 in the morning, but by 8, 9, 10 in the evening, they're completely hopeless and they need to be asleep. And again, that's driven by the circadian system, and they have a slightly shorter and an earlier timed circadian system. And so the regulation of the timing of your sleep is very much driven by the circadian system. And so that these two processes work together. So if a person wakes up in the morning and they've had a good rest, they don't have much sleep pressure. So the need for this homeostatic sleep drive is low, and therefore they don't need much alerting from the circadian system either. But as the day progresses and the longer that they're awake, they accumulate the sleep pressure. And so in turn, the circadian system must work a little bit harder to provide the alerting stimulus that is needed to keep the person awake throughout the daytime. And we generally get to the point in the evening where the sun goes down shortly after your body produces melatonin, which signals that it's time to sleep. And if all is well, the person will then act or behave in the correct manner and go to bed, and they will dissipate their sleep pressure, and the circadian system can in turn stop producing that alerting effect and allow the person to have some deep sleep. So that's the way the two-process model of sleep regulation generally works. But this is really superimposed upon the neural wake promoting and sleep generating systems within the brain as well. So I'm not going to go into the details of this, but essentially there are two components. There's the wake promoting component, and there is the sleep generating component. So wakefulness is promoted by an ascending arousal system from the brain stem. So that starts off at all of these little dots over here, and this then moves forward and activates the forebrain structures. And so ultimately, the wake promoting system prepares nerve cells in the cerebral cortex to interpret and analyze sensory information. So this makes sense, because remember I said right in the beginning that sleep's a behavioral state in which our sensory capacities are hugely reduced to allow us that downtime or that space to disconnect from the world and to recover. But when we awake, we need to be processing and engaging, and so these structures are really important so that the sensory processing can take place. The major neurochemicals which are involved in the wake promoting system, I'm sure you've heard of some of these, are dopamine, norepinephrine, serotonin, and histamine. And so in any cases where these are out of kilter in terms of either we have too much or too little, or their receptors are insensitive or oversensitive, then of course we can have issues with either sleep or prolonged wakefulness. The sleep generating side of the system basically enables it activates the neurons which shut down the arousal system. So if we didn't have the sleep generating side of things, we would be perpetually awake. And the sleep generating side of things shuts that down so that we can have the peace and the rest that we need. And this system is concentrated in the preoptic area of the hypothalamus. So essentially, the sleep generating system ensures that neural communication is inhibited. The precise molecular triggers or biomarkers or that are involved haven't really been fully elucidated in this side of things, but something called adenosine certainly seems to be a candidate. And indeed, it makes sense that, well, there's some evidence to show that, sorry, that's my dog, she's terribly noisy, doing her sleeping right now. So there's some evidence to show that as adenosine builds up in the brain, we are more likely to feel sleepy. So it seems to be linked with sleep pressure. And it's interesting to note that caffeine, for example, can compete adenosine for binding in the brain. And it is thought that that is possibly why something like caffeine is able to delay that sensation of feeling tired, or to at least reduce sleep pressure temporarily. In addition, the sleep generating side of things also takes input from the lower brainstem about the state of the body, like a decrease in body temperature. So a decrease in body temperature at the end of the day is one of the sleep signals that our body uses to correctly ascertain whether or not it's time to be awake or asleep. And it also gets information from the forebrain about the emotional and cognitive states, which could also further promote or inhibit sleep. And then also, while we sleep, there are neurons in the pons, which switch intermittently, or help switch us intermittently between REM and non-REM sleep. So as you can see, this is a pretty complex scenario. There's a lot of sort of checks and balances that need to happen for us to have healthy sleep. And there's a lot that can go wrong, and indeed it does. But it's quite miraculous that it works as well as it does, as often as it does. So here's the question: why do we sleep? Well, we certainly don't know all, but the primary things that seem to be important are that it's critical for survival. No sleep equals no life. It's important for cognition and productivity, for mental health, and for physical health. But before I go into each of these super briefly, let me just quickly touch on what happens when we do sleep. Well, this is what we know so far in terms of a summary anyway. Sleep's super important for brain connectivity. So what does this mean? When we sleep, many of these little neural pathways that we made use of in the daytime get reinforced at nighttime. And this can relate to storing of new information, so laying down memories. It can also relate to the learning of new motor tasks. So maybe learning to crawl and walk, learning to drive, learning to play a new sport or a new game. All of these have a whole lot of, or series of neural pathways and connections that need to take place to make the movement fluid and eventually automatic, or that enable us to retain information and to remember things. And when we sleep, these pathways get reinforced, which helps to embed the task, or embed the skill, or embed the knowledge. So that's super important. Something that you'll hear a bit more about on Wednesday, I believe, is the glymphatic function of sleep. So there's this really neat set of experiments which have been done recently, which show that when we sleep, the size of the brain actually slightly reduces to allow for this increase in cerebrospinal fluid to flow around the brain, which enables the removal of toxins from the brain while we sleep. And there's a lot of interest recently, or since 2017, in something called beta amyloid, because one of the toxins that's removed through this glymphatic function is beta amyloid, and there's now evidence to show that an accumulation of beta amyloid in the brain seems to be associated with the progression of neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's. So this glymphatic function that occurs during sleep is clearly super important. Oddly enough, sleep is a period of reduced caloric use. So you might think, well, what's the point of that? We have 24-hour access to food. Surely I don't need to be calorie restricted through over a 24-hour period. But it's obviously, I'm guessing it's a throwback from the days when we were perhaps more hunter-gatherer-like, where the next meal wasn't quite so secure. So when we sleep, we use about 10%, we have about a 10% reduction in our metabolic rate, which means that we need 10% less fuel for that particular time, so that's quite useful. When we sleep, we restore our brain energy stores. which is clearly useful and part of our preparation for being good to go again the next day, is a super important immune role for sleep too. Now, I'm going to break the immune system down into two systems. This is super crude, and it's certainly not exactly the way that it works, but from an understanding perspective, it's quite easy for us to relate. So the immune system has two primary components, the innate and the adaptive immune responses. So the innate immune response is primarily active during the daytime. And this is the part of your immune system which defends us against inhaled, ingested, or absorbed pathogens. So that makes sense. We're out and about, we're in contact, we're more likely to be in contact with various pathogens. And so it's good that we can have that side of our immune system very active and protecting us. When we sleep, however, the adaptive immune response becomes more dominant. And this is the part of our immune system which, for example, makes antibodies to defend us against the viruses to which we're exposed during the daytime. The immune system is super busy trawling and removing damaged or mutated cells. So it's a very big anti-cancer function as well. So it's important when we sleep that we have sufficient time for the immune system to do its job, and for the adaptive immunity to literally needs the time to be able to defend us and to protect us from an immunological perspective. And then, of course, when we sleep, we reverse any performance loss that was associated with wakefulness. So the longer that we're awake for, physically we change. We become more clumsy, less coordinated, we tire more easily. From a mental or cognitive perspective, we become less fluent sometimes in our speech. We can't multitask so well. Our memory is often challenged. We don't feel quite so creative. We're often less productive. So these are the things that are associated with prolonged wakefulness, and most of these things are reversed when we sleep. So thankfully, those are all pretty useful reasons to be getting a good night's sleep. Going back to the four categories of why we sleep, and the first being survival. At the end of the day, it's actually sleep's a not negotiable aspect of survival. It seems to have been preserved throughout evolution, and we can only conclude that it's beneficial for all creatures, great and small, even if we don't yet fully understand its significance. And for sure, what we'll learn on Wednesday is that sleep is very different from organism to organism, creature to creature. There's by no means sort of a carbon copy of the best way to sleep. And we all have different sleep needs. Even within the human species, we all have different sleep needs, but we certainly can't go without it. And this was first shown in this really neat experiment by Reshafen in 1983, in which he subjected some rats to prolonged sleep deprivation. And essentially what he did was he let the rats live on this little disc over here, and they had ad libitum access to food and water, but he also put little electrodes on their heads so that he could look at their brain activity. And when he noticed that they would fall asleep based on the electrical activity in the brain, this disc would start to move, and that means that the rat would have to move to avoid plopping into the water pan underneath the disc. And so they learned very quickly that as soon as the disc moved, they needed to move themselves. And of course, you can't move when you're asleep. So by this mechanism, he was able to keep the rats awake for an extended period of time. And what he observed was that the sleep-deprived rats suffered severe pathology, and ultimately they died, whereas the controlled rats didn't. And I just want you to take a look here and see how diverse this pathology is, ranging from fluid in the lungs, stomach ulcers, internal hemorrhage, atrophied testicles, enlarged bladder, and I really look at this debilitated appearance, motor weakness, and reduction in EEG activity. So what this tells me is that the number of systems affected by this chronic sleep deprivation are diverse. In fact, it seemed that the pathway to this to the demise of the rats wasn't the same for each creature. So different systems and different organs were affected differently between the different creatures, which speaks to the inter-individual susceptibility to sleep deprivation. And indeed, the time to death ranged from 5 to 33 days, which is something I think that we can probably semi-relate to in humans. There's some people that seem to deal super well with sleep deprivation, and there are others who don't. And so it seems to be a very inter-individual thing indeed. I won't speak too much about the sort of the cognitive side of things. I'm going to leave that for the neuropsychologists, but one of the ways that we can understand cognition in a sort of real world way and that we can measure it would be through measuring or looking at workplace productivity. And so this survey was done by the RAND Corporation, and they looked at productivity losses attributed to sleep deprivation. And they observed that in Japan, for example, 2.92% of Japan's GDP over a year was a loss of 2.92% was attributed to sleep deprivation. Similarly, in the States, it was 2.28%. And they worked out that the US loses an equivalent of 1.2 million working days annually due to insufficient sleep. And if individuals sleeping less than 6 hours started sleeping 6 to 7 hours, so that's just a small increase, they could add approximately 226 billion to the US economy. So I think no one's going to argue that the role of sleep in cognition and therefore in terms of workplace and productivity is critical, but it's just nice to see the numbers to that too. Again, I'm going to leave the sleep and mental health side of things to the experts on that for later on in the week, but just to say, because it wouldn't be rather incomplete not to mention this, that the relationship between sleep and mental health is so strong. There's anybody can attest to the fact that if you have acute sleep deprivation, your mood will deteriorate. You often generally feel more grumpy, less in control of your emotions, more impulsive, more likely to make risky decisions, for example. And by the same token, once your mood deteriorates, that can very often feed back to impair sleep or make sleep difficult. So there's a bi-directional relationship between the two of those. And there's also, of course, a longer term relationship between chronic sleep deprivation and mental health. And that's been really well established for many, many years. In fact, this is probably the area of sleep research that is most well researched. Sleep deprivation is, of course, associated with insomnia and other sleep-related disorders, because that by nature the disorders interfere with sleep, which cause sleep deprivation. And then, of course, as sleep deprivation mounts, that can actually exacerbate the sleep disorder itself. So also that's a two-way relationship. And it's been well established that sleep disorders are associated with problems or challenges with either mood and or mental health. In fact, I don't think there is a mental health disorder that that does not go hand in hand with a sleep-related disorder. So that's been well established. In fact, in people in the general population, about 10 to 15% of people suffer from chronic insomnia, but in people with mental health disorders, this number goes up to around 50 to 80%. So that's quite staggering. More recently, a whole lot of research is starting to emanate now around the associations between sleep and cardiometabolic diseases. So there's quite a lot of evidence to show quite clearly that if you have either reduced, shortened, or disturbed sleep, you increase risk for cardiometabolic disease. So this is increased risk for weight gain on one hand, heart disease, and also diabetes. And of course, it's a two-way relationship such that as the disease progresses, they often then feed back to worsen sleep. I mentioned the circadian rhythms a little bit earlier when we spoke about sleep regulation. Now, it's possible to disrupt a circadian rhythm. You just need to think about shift workers who need to work at night and typically sleep in the day. They have an extremely disrupted sleep circadian rhythm on a long-term basis. And when circadian rhythmicity is disrupted, we often experience, there's good evidence to show that there's an increased risk for cardiometabolic disease. And as the disease progresses, again, it can further exacerbate the circadian dysrhythmia too. And then, of course, there's also a relationship between poor sleep and a disrupted circadian rhythm. The two go hand in hand. So some prospective or long-term studies which have followed people over a big period of time and has looked at how much they sleep at the start of the study, and then they measured some outcomes, has shown that both short sleep, so that's less than 6 hours, and long sleep more than 10, are associated with increased all-cause and cardiovascular disease mortality. So what that means is that over time, you're more likely to die at a slightly younger age and more likely to die too of cardiovascular disease than others. So just very briefly, so you can understand a little bit more about this, this is the sleep obesity sort of diabetes model that has been proposed. And essentially what the evidence shows at this point is that when a person has reduced sleep, poor or mistimed or too short, there are changes in a number of hormones like leptin, ghrelin, and orexin, which are involved in appetite. So leptin is a satiety hormone, and that seems to be reduced. Ghrelin is a hormone that makes you feel hungry, and those levels seem to go up when we are sleep deprived. And that, of course, together can increase our appetite and provide or put us in a space where we are more likely to overeat. And this has been shown in both short and longer term experiments. And so over time, we're at an increased risk for weight gain and ultimately for obesity, because what happens together with that is that there are changes in other hormones like melatonin and thyroid stimulating hormone, which can both actually reduce your energy expenditure. And apart from the changes in these hormones, which happens with sleep deprivation, there are also behavioral changes. So for example, a sleep deprived person is more likely to make poor food choices. They're more likely to choose food that is sweet or salty, as opposed to the savory, more healthy types of food. And they're also more likely to be inactive or sedentary, or maybe just miss an exercise session or two because they don't feel great. And so again, together, this also sets you up for this energy imbalance, which can promote weight gain and ultimately obesity. And once a person develops obesity, that of course can further impact their lifestyle. They may now choose to be even less active. That can impact their mood and their mental health and increase stress, and that can further feed back and further reduce sleep. On top of that, obesity is a risk factor for the sleep disordered breathing disorder called obstructive sleep apnea, which you'll hear about on Thursday. And it also interferes with the amplitude of our circadian rhythms, and these two also further exacerbate our sleep problems. On the other side of the equation, when we're sleep deprived, we also go into a more inflammatory state, and this is driven by our nervous system in part. So there's changes in the sympathovagal balance with our nervous system. We often go more into fight and flight mode and less into our rest and digest mode. And there are changes in a number of stress-related hormones too, which put us into an inflammatory state, which increases our risk for insulin resistance. And as we become insulin resistant, over time, if this is not well managed, we have a greater chance of together with obesity, of becoming diabetic. And then again, once the disease itself progresses, not only the symptoms, but the being diabetic can also impact your lifestyle, mood, mental health, stress, and further exacerbate sleep. And so poor sleep, obesity, and diabetes have been dubbed interacting epidemics, which are something that we really need to take care of moving forward. I mentioned earlier that sleep is important for the immunity, for the immune system, and this is just a nice experiment just to highlight that. In this particular experiment, they measured people's sleep at the beginning of the experiment, and then they swabbed their nasal cavities with the rhinovirus, and then they isolated or quarantined the individuals, and they observed them over the next coming days to see who developed symptoms of the cold and who didn't. And essentially those who were the short sleepers, those who slept 5 hours or less, were 4.5 times more likely to develop symptoms than those who were the 7-hour sleepers over the course of the experiment. And similarly, there's a link with sleep duration and likelihood of injury in athletes. So these were young athletes they were followed over a period of 21 months. And they measured their sleep at the beginning of the experiment, and then they observed who became injured over the course of the experiment. And they saw that the athletes who slept less than 8 hours, so these 5, 6, and 7-hour athletes over here, were 1.7 times more likely to become injured over the course of the observational experiment compared to those who slept 8 hours and more. All right, so we've had quite a lot of input there into what sleep is and how it's regulated and why we sleep. And so we just need to check out now with what exactly healthy sleep is. So a lot of people think sleep, they just think duration. Believe me, it's probably more important is to consider quality and timing of sleep than duration. Although duration is important, it's certainly not the be all and end all. And so actually healthy sleep is a balance of the correct duration for you at that specific time in your life, as well as good quality and appropriately timed sleep. So the question is always, how much sleep do we need? And so this is based on the guidelines from the National Sleep Foundation in the US. And you can see that for each of the age groups going from newborn here through to older adults, sleep need certainly does decrease with aging, and it stabilizes from adulthood onwards. And if we just focus on the adulthood side here, adults typically need between 7 to 9 hours of sleep per night. And the little grey-green, sorry, what are these color? Turquoise colors here show that for some people, 6 hours is sufficient, but for others, 10 or 11 hours might actually be necessary. So there's quite a big range. So what I really like about these guidelines is they don't say everybody needs 8 hours of sleep, because that's absolute rubbish. They say rather there's a range. There's probably a bell-shaped distribution of this range, where maybe most people do need closer to 8, but for some people 10 is necessary and other 6 is okay. And I think it very much also depends on a number of other factors, and even your own sleep need might change with seasons. It might change with whether or not you're healthy or ill, how much exercise you're doing, etc. There are a number of factors which can change this. Around the same time, a group presented a consensus statement on behalf of the American Academy of Sleep and the Sleep Research Society, also in the US. Essentially, they reviewed all the literature and they said, well, how certain are we, that's green, that a given amount of sleep is linked to optimal health? And they graded all of these different things, where green is essentially that they were very certain that that amount of sleep is appropriate. Red would be inappropriate. This is where they would be uncertain in the orange zone. And essentially that you can see here that whether they spoke and investigated evidence around general health, cardiovascular health, metabolic health, immune function, human performance, pain, and I suppose mental health too, for the most part, they were pretty well agreed that 7 to 9 hours of sleep was optimal. That certainly less than 6 was not appropriate, and there was a lot of uncertainty around the longer sleep, which is interesting, and it's different to the previous recommendations. You could see that they didn't have any consensus around the information for sleep and breast cancer, and the mortality has a different picture, where they're more certain that sort of 7 to 8 hours of sleep seems to be appropriate, and that there's a lot that they're also very certain that longer sleep is not good for mortality, or is inappropriate. And so their guidelines were slightly different, and they said adults should sleep 7 or more hours per night on a regular basis to promote optimal health. And that when it comes to this long sleep, sleeping more than 9 hours on a regular basis might be appropriate for young adults or individuals, because that's related to growth, or individuals recovering from sleep debt, or individuals with illnesses, of course. But for anybody else, it's uncertain whether this long sleep, that's more than 9 hours, is associated with a health risk. But in addition to sleep duration, we really need to consider sleep timing too. So this is what a consistent sleeper would look like. In this particular little image shows you sleep that's been measured over the course of a week. We can see here Thursday, Friday, Saturday through to the Wednesday the next week. And this is the person in the daytime, and the blue bit is this person's sleep. And you can see that from day to day, they have a beautifully consistent bedtime and wake up time and consistency of their sleep duration. And that's important because your body loves rhythm and routine. It can better anticipate sleep when you do the same thing each day. And also it helps train a nice, strong, robust circadian rhythm. That's what an inconsistent sleep pattern would look like, and that's not desirable. The other thing we need to consider with sleep is how continuous it is. And anybody who is a new parent and is constantly woken up by a baby needing their attention will attest to the fact that sleep continuity is king. In this particular study, they showed it really nicely. The individuals in the first situation were given 3 nights of a 7.5 hour sleep opportunity. They were pretty efficient at 92%. That means that of the 7.5 hours in bed trying to sleep, they actually attained about 92% of time they were actually asleep. Then in this situation, they were given 3 nights of sleep where they were given a 7.5 hour sleep opportunity, but they kept getting woken up. So they only accumulated a 4 to 4.5 hours of sleep in over those nights. So they were very low in efficiency at 58%. And in the third scenario, they were just given a short sleep opportunity, 4 to 4.5 hours. And of course, they were super efficient because they were pretty tired. So in situation 1 and 2, the sleep opportunity were the same. And in situations 2 and 3, the sleep actualization was the same. And what they observed is that in situation 2, where you have a normal sleep opportunity, but very discontinuous or broken sleep, you have less slow wave sleep. So we can appreciate the importance of that now. And it was also associated with a lower positive mood the next day. So just super quick, because I can't really not touch on these. The 2 most common sleep disorders are insomnia, as I'm sure you're aware, and obstructive sleep apnea, which you'll hear about a little later in the week. Insomnia can come in three forms, where either you may struggle to fall asleep, you may struggle to stay asleep, or you may wake too early. To be classified as insomnia, this needs to happen on 3 or more nights of a week. It's acute insomnia if it's been going on for less than 3 months, and this is actually present in about 30 to 40% of adults. That's strikingly high. Whereas chronic insomnia, it's been going on for at least 3 months, and this affects 10 to 15% of adults. It's more common in women and increases with age. Obstructive sleep apnea, as you'll learn, is a sleep-related breathing disorder whereby the upper airways collapse during sleep periodically, prevent air passing through to the lungs. I'm just going to skim over this because we're going to learn more about it later, but it's a deadly and underdiagnosed condition. Up to 80% of people with apnea don't actually know that they have it. It's more common in men than women when the age is less than 65. This equalizes a bit in the older age, and it's more common with obesity, as you'll learn on Thursday as well. Both of these sleep disorders impair daytime function. So the people will experience difficulties with concentration, cognition, creativity, mood, energy. They're more likely to have fatigue-related accidents and will also report reduced quality of life. And importantly, they're both associated with a wide range of health problems, ranging from weight gain, ultimately obesity, hypertension, stroke, and metabolic disorders. But there's a new kid on the block here, and this is something called social jet lag, which has been dubbed an Circadian disease. And that's a mismatch between the 24-hour light-dark cycle and your sleep-wake behavior. And so sleep need is often less than the sleep that more than the sleep that one gets. And this is a behavioral sleep disorder, if you like, where a person might have a given sleep need, but through their behavior, they give themselves a shortened sleep opportunity, and it's often out of sync with the light-dark cycle. And so the result is chronic sleep insufficiency. And the primary culprit is artificial light at night. So this image here was taken through a satellite orbiting Earth on 312 times to create this image. But you can see that even down here in Cape Town at nighttime, we're doing twinkling like a star. And although this light in our cities is useful from a productivity and a safety perspective, it's obviously the concern is that the light is getting closer into our closer to us. It's not only the street lights now that can disturb our sleep, but it's the lights that's coming off our devices. And I'm not going to go into that in too much detail, but the short of it is that when light reaches the eye, it travels by a specific pathway to the master clock in the suprachiasmatic nucleus. And then that signal is transmitted to the pineal gland in the brain. And in the presence of light, let me put it this way, in the absence of light, when the light levels drop, the pineal gland makes melatonin, and that gets distributed to all the cells in your body with melatonin receptors, which signals that it's time to sleep. And so when we have too much light exposure at nighttime, we don't get this increase in melatonin at the end of the day, which means that our signal for sleep is quite delayed, and therefore our sleep opportunity is reduced. And so William Dement is like the godfather of sleep medicine, really a pioneer, and he said that the loss of sleep time and natural sleep rhythms is the tragic legacy of a single profound technology advance, the light bulb. Thomas Edison's light bulb, patented in 1880, effectively changed or overrode the natural order of the world, creating new environmental patterns of light and dark that have often played havoc with human sleep patterns. So as an aside, Thomas Edison apparently regarded sleep as a waste of time and tried to minimize it as much as possible. He was a polyphasic sleeper who did the 20-minute naps in every 4 hours. So obviously he, not needing to sleep, had a very strong need to create light at night to enable him to be productive, but it's certainly creating havoc with us now. And so just to end, healthy sleep is essentially sleep in which the timing of your sleep is in sync with your natural body clock. So owls have a later sleep timing and larks an earlier sleep timing. Your sleep and circadian patterns are aligned with the environment, which means that for the most part, we primarily sleep when it's dark. We have regular sleep in terms of timing and duration. We can fall asleep easily and maintain sleep. We don't do too much catch-up sleep on weekends, and we're not reliant on naps. We can sleep without medication, and most importantly is that we awake feeling refreshed and we have high or optimal levels of daytime functioning. So really, the short of it is that sleep's a complicated process which we're learning about all the time, but it certainly enables you to be on your A game from a physical health, mental health, emotional resilience, physical performance, and cognitive performance perspective.
Thank you very, very much indeed. And thank you, Graham, for introducing everybody, and to Sibasiso for his assistance. And I see my colleague Zuleika is there as well. Thank you very much.